Calvin was standing outside Maplewood Elementary when the girl walked up to him. She was maybe 9 years old, small for her age, with dark braids and a backpack covered in star stickers. She stopped directly in front of him, looked up with eyes the color of storm clouds, gray-blue, unmistakable, and said it plainly, the way children say things that adults spend lifetimes avoiding. "My mom told me you're my dad." The noise of the pickup line engines idling, teachers calling names, sneakers scraping pavement, all of it fell away. Calvin felt the paper coffee cup in his hand, but couldn't feel his fingers. He didn't know this child. He had never seen her before in his life. And yet those eyes. He knew those eyes. They were his father's eyes. The school pickup line at Maplewood Elementary ran along the east side of the building, and Calvin Hartley had learned exactly where to stand third lamppost from the corner, far enough from the crowd to see Miles the moment he came through the double doors, close enough to reach him before the second bell. 6 years of doing this had turned it into muscle memory. He knew which teachers were on duty on which days. He knew that Miles always stopped to retie his left shoe at the bottom of the steps. He knew the rhythm of this place the way he knew the rhythm of a job site, by repetition, by showing up, by refusing to let anything catch him off guard. He was not prepared for the girl. She crossed the pickup lane without hesitation, threading between a minivan and a woman pushing a stroller, and stopped directly in front of Calvin, as though she had practiced the route. Her braids were neat. Her star-covered backpack was still zipped, which meant she hadn't been to class yet, or had packed up carefully before leaving. She looked up at him with the kind of directness that most adults unlearn by the time they're 30. "My mom told me you're my dad." Calvin stared at her. She stared back. Neither of them moved. He was 36 years old. He had poured concrete in the rain, argued down city inspectors, and sat in a hospital room while his wife's heart monitor flatlined. He had learned through all of it to keep his face controlled. But standing in the October sun outside a suburban elementary school, holding a cup of coffee that was going cold, he had nothing to offer this child except his stillness. "What's your name?" he finally said. "Sadie." She reached into the front pocket of her backpack and produced a photograph, holding it out with both hands. "Mom said you might not remember her. She said to show you this." The photo was old, the edges slightly soft, the colors faded, the way prints from 10 years ago looked when they'd been handled too many times. It showed 2 people at an outdoor festival standing close, both laughing. The man was younger, thinner in the face, wearing a gray jacket Calvin no longer owned. The woman beside him had dark red hair and a smile that tilted slightly to the left. Claire. Calvin had not said her name out loud in years. He'd trained himself out of it the same way he'd trained himself out of other useless habits, by replacing it with work, with Miles's school schedule, with the particular discipline of a man who has decided that looking backward serves no purpose. He had been good at it. He had been, he thought, genuinely fine. He looked at the photograph for a long moment, then looked back at the girl. Her eyes were gray-blue, the same shade as his father's, the same shade as Calvin's own, though he rarely thought about that. "Where is your mom right now?" he asked. Before Sadie could answer, Calvin heard his name not spoken, but almost gasped, and he looked up to find Claire Donovan standing 20 feet away at the edge of the parking lot. She was older, which was obvious and expected, but what struck him first was the expression on her face. It was not guilt exactly. It was closer to the look of someone who had been waiting for a particular thing to happen for a very long time, and was now watching it happen and discovering that they had not actually prepared for it. She walked toward them quickly, her hand reaching for Sadie's shoulder. "Sadie, honey, I told you to wait by the—" "I found him," Sadie said, simply. Claire's hand settled on her daughter's shoulder and stayed there. She looked at Calvin. He looked at her. The parking lot moved around them. A car honked somewhere. A teacher called out a student's name. A group of kids burst through the double doors in a wave of backpacks and noise, and none of it touched the 4 feet of space between them. "Hi, Calvin," Claire said. Her voice was steady. He gave her credit for that. Claire. That was all either of them managed before the double doors swung open again, and Miles came down the steps, stopping at the bottom to retie his left shoe exactly as he always did. He was 10 years old, dark-haired like Calvin, already tall for his age. He looked up, spotted his father, and started across the sidewalk, then noticed the woman and the girl standing with him, and slowed down. "Dad." "Hey, bud." Calvin put a hand on his son's back as Miles reached him a reflex as automatic as breathing. "This is Claire. And this is Sadie." Miles looked at Sadie. Sadie looked at Miles. The wary assessment of two children who have not yet been told what they are to each other. "Hi," Miles said. "Hi," Sadie said. Calvin looked at Claire. There were 10 years of unanswered questions stacked between them, and this was not the place for any of them, not in a school parking lot, with both children standing right there, not with a crossing guard, watching from the corner, and other parents streaming past. "I need to talk to you," he said. Claire nodded. "I know. Not here." "No." She agreed. Not here. He thought about it for exactly the amount of time it took Miles to shift his backpack from one shoulder to the other. Blue Ridge Coffee was 4 blocks away. It was neutral, it was public, and it had a back corner booth where he'd sat through enough difficult contractor calls to know the noise level made private conversation possible. "Blue Ridge Coffee," he said. "Tonight, 7 o'clock. Claire glanced down at Sadie doing the mental calculation that parents do babysitter bedtime logistics. Then she looked back at him. 7:30, she said. 7:30. He agreed. He took Miles to the car. He buckled his seatbelt on autopilot, started the engine, checked the mirrors. Miles was quiet for the first 2 blocks, which was unusual. The boy was not generally quiet. "Dad," Miles said finally. "Who was that girl?" Calvin kept his eyes on the road. "Someone I need to figure out." "She has your eyes," Miles said. Calvin said nothing. He drove the rest of the way home with both hands on the wheel and the photograph still in his jacket pocket, its edges pressing lightly against his ribs. The house was a Craftsman on Sycamore Street that Calvin had bought 5 years ago and spent the following 2 renovating on weekends, slowly the way he did things he cared about. He'd redone the kitchen himself, new cabinets, new counters, the tile backsplash, taking him 3 weekends and 1 cracked fingernail. The back porch had taken an entire summer. Miles had been 4 when they moved in, young enough that the new house had simply become the house, the only one he really remembered. After dinner, after Miles's homework and his bath, and the 15-minute negotiation over whether he could stay up to finish a chapter of his book. Yes, 1 chapter. Not 3. Calvin sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and a glass of water and tried to work. He had a bid due on a commercial project in Weaverville, a subcontractor invoice that needed disputing, and 4 unreturned emails from a client in Black Mountain who changed her mind every 2 weeks about the kitchen layout. He read the same invoice 3 times without processing it. He had met Claire Donovan at the Asheville Arts Festival 10 years ago, a weekend in October, when the mountains were at peak color and half the city had turned out for the open-air market along the river. She'd been behind a booth selling handmade ceramics, small bowls with uneven edges that she described as intentionally imperfect, which made him laugh because he spent his professional life making sure things were level. They'd talked for 2 hours. He'd come back the next day. By December, they were spending every weekend together, and by March, he was using the word future in conversations without flinching. Then in April, she was gone. No call, no text, no note at her apartment, which was emptied out so completely that her landlord assumed she'd left the state. Calvin had called her cell phone until it went to a disconnected message. He'd driven by her ceramics studio and found it dark. Her friends, the few he'd met, said they didn't know anything, and he'd believed them because they looked as confused as he was. His mother had told him about 2 weeks after Claire disappeared that she'd heard from someone that Claire had moved to Charlotte with someone she'd been seeing on the side. Calvin had asked how she'd heard that. His mother said she couldn't remember exactly. He'd accepted it because the alternative that Claire had simply vanished without explanation was harder to sit with, and a man can only spend so long sitting with things that have no resolution. He'd filed it away. He'd moved forward. 2 years later, he'd met Diane, and they'd had 4 good years together before the aneurysm that took her on a Tuesday morning in February, when Miles was not yet 2. After that, moving forward was no longer a choice he made. It was just what he did, because Miles needed someone to be upright and functional, and Calvin Hartley was above most things functional. He closed the laptop at 9:45 and took the photograph out of his pocket. He set it on the table in the kitchen light and looked at it properly for the first time. He and Claire at the festival that second afternoon after he'd come back. Someone must have taken it without them noticing. Neither of them was posed. They were just laughing at something turned slightly toward each other, in the easy way of 2 people who have already decided they like each other and haven't yet learned to be careful about it. He didn't know what Claire was going to tell him tomorrow night. He didn't know what a DNA test would say. He didn't know honestly what he was hoping for, because both outcomes carried weight he hadn't finished calculating. What he knew was that a 9-year-old girl had handed him a photograph and looked at him with his father's eyes, and he had spent 6 years building a life on the principle that he could not afford to look away from things that were true just because they were inconvenient. He was going to Blue Ridge Coffee at 7:30. He was going to sit across from Claire Donovan and listen. That was as far as he'd gotten, and for tonight it was enough. He turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs to check on Miles. His son was asleep with the book open on his chest, 1 chapter turned into 3. Calvin set it on the nightstand, marked the page, and stood there for a moment in the dark, watching his kid breathe. Then he went to bed and lay there and waited for morning. Blue Ridge Coffee was the kind of place that had been there long enough to stop trying to look like anything other than what it was: mismatched chairs, exposed brick, a chalkboard menu that hadn't changed its core offerings in a decade. Calvin had been coming here since before he bought the house on Sycamore Street. He knew the back corner booth got good light in the mornings and privacy at night, and he'd claimed it at 7:15, ordered a black coffee he didn't particularly want, and sat with his hands flat on the table. Claire arrived at 7:32. She'd left her hair down, which he noticed, and immediately told himself was not relevant information. She spotted him without looking around, which meant she'd been here before, and knew the layout, and she slid into the booth across from him with the careful movements of someone who had rehearsed this moment, and then decided the rehearsal wasn't going to help anyway. The server came. Claire ordered tea. They waited until the server left. "I didn't disappear," Claire said. "I need you to know that first, before anything else." Calvin kept his expression even. "All right. I found out I was pregnant in May. You and I had already been. It had been a few weeks since we'd last seen each other, but we were still. I didn't think we were over." She wrapped both hands around the mug the server had set down, though the tea was still steeping and it wasn't cold in the room. "I called your cell 3 times, no answer. I sent emails. I sent a certified letter to your mother's address on Hazel Mill Road, because that was the only physical address I had for you. You were still in the apartment then, but I didn't have that address written down anywhere. I was on Hazel Mill in my mother's guest room for 2 months that spring," Calvin said. "Pipes burst at my place. I told you that." "I know. That's why I sent it there." Claire's jaw tightened slightly. "I sent 2 letters. One regular one certified with a return receipt. I included an ultrasound photo in the second one. About 10 days after I sent it, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. It was your mother." Calvin said nothing. He was very still. "She told me you had received everything. She said you'd read the letters, seen the photo, and that you didn't want to be contacted again. She said her exact words, and I remember them because I have thought about them a great deal over the past 9 years. She said, "Calvin has a plan for his life, and this isn't part of it." Claire looked directly at him. "She also told me you'd already moved on, and were seeing someone seriously. She asked me not to reach out again." The coffee in front of Calvin had gone from hot to warm. He looked at it. 2 weeks after that call, Claire continued, "I got a second call. Same number. Your mother again. She told me she'd spoken to a family attorney, and that if I pursued contact, there could be complications. I was 26. I was pregnant. I was alone, and I was scared. So I stopped." Her voice didn't break, but it thinned slightly. "I moved back to Brevard to be near my sister. I had Sadie in January. I have raised her by myself for 9 years. And I never told her about you until 6 months ago, when she started asking questions I couldn't answer with anything honest." Calvin sat with all of it for a long moment. The murmur of other conversations filled the space around them. Someone laughing at the counter, the steam wand on the espresso machine rained starting against the front window. "She said you went to Charlotte," he said, finally. "My mother told me you'd left with someone from Charlotte. That's what she told me about 2 weeks after you stopped returning my calls." Claire looked at him steadily. "I have never been to Charlotte." He believed her. That was the thing, he believed her immediately, which meant something had been structurally wrong with the story he'd been living inside for 10 years, and he needed a moment to understand what that meant for everything built on top of it. "I want to do a DNA test," he said. "Yes," Claire said. "So do I. There's a lab on Merriman Avenue. They do court-admissible testing. I can call in the morning and get us an appointment." "Okay. Sadie would need to come in." "I know. She will." Claire finally let go of the mug and sat back. "She wants this, Calvin. She's the one who pushed me to find you. She saw that photograph in a box in my closet last spring, and she wouldn't let it go." He thought about the girl in the parking lot handing him the photo with both hands, looking at him without any of the anxiety an adult would have brought to that moment. Sadie had walked up to a stranger and stated a fact. She had been in that moment braver than anyone twice her age had any business being. "She's something," he said. The corner of Claire's mouth moved. "She really is." The lab on Merriman Avenue had a waiting room with plastic chairs and a television mounted too high on the wall, playing a morning news program with the sound turned down. Calvin sat with Miles on one side of the room and watched Claire help Sadie fill out a form on the other side. Sadie kept swinging her feet because the chair was too tall for her, her heels tapping a light, irregular rhythm against the plastic base. The test itself took less than 10 minutes. A cheek swab, a form, a sample number written on a card that Calvin put in his wallet. Results in 3 to 5 business days, the technician said. Standard processing. Calvin's attorney, a straightforward man named Graham Sutter, who had handled his business contracts for 4 years, called on the 3rd day. "Results are in," Graham said. "Lab emailed them to the address you registered. You should open them somewhere you can sit down." Calvin was in his truck in the parking lot of a hardware store. He opened the email on his phone and read it twice. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. He sat there for a while, engine running, the radio playing something he couldn't hear. Then he called Claire. "I saw it," she said when she picked up. "Yeah." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I'm sorry," Claire said quietly. "For 9 years of... I'm sorry you didn't know her." "You didn't do this," Calvin said. "Don't apologize for it." He drove home and called Graham back. He told him about the 2 letters, the certified mail, the phone calls from his mother. Graham listened without interrupting, which was what Calvin paid him to do. "I want you to check something," Calvin said. "My old email account, the one I had 10 years ago, the personal one. I still have access to it. Can the settings show if any forwarding rules were ever created?" "Yes," Graham said. "Log in and go to Settings, then Filters and Forwarded Addresses. Do it now while we're talking." Calvin opened his laptop at the kitchen table. The old account was still active. He'd kept it for archived project files. He navigated to the Settings menu and opened the Filters tab. There was one rule. Created in April 10 years ago, any incoming email containing the name Claire in the sender field or subject line was to be automatically forwarded to a secondary address and then deleted from the inbox. The secondary address was his mother's. Calvin read the rule 3 times. He read the creation date. He read the forwarding address. "Graham," he said, "I can hear it in your voice. Document everything. Screenshot the rule with the timestamp. Don't delete it. Don't alter it." Graham's voice was measured and professional. "This changes the scope of the situation significantly." "Yes," Calvin said. "It does." He took the screenshots. He saved them to a folder he labeled with the date. Then he sat at the kitchen table in his quiet house and thought about his mother, Helen Hartley, 71 years old, who had taught Sunday school at First Presbyterian for 20 years and made Miles a birthday cake every year without being asked, who had called Calvin every Sunday morning since his father died, who had held his hand in the hospital the night Diane didn't make it, who had apparently decided 10 years ago that she knew better than he did about what his life should contain. Dorothy Webb lived on the same street she'd worked her whole career, a fact she mentioned within the first 2 minutes of Calvin sitting down across from her at her kitchen table, with the mild pride of someone who has made deliberate choices and stands behind them. She was 74, recently retired from the Postal Service after 31 years, and she had the organized mind of someone who had spent 3 decades keeping track of where things went. Graham had tracked her down through a records request and had called her the evening before to let her know Calvin would be coming. She'd been the carrier assigned to the Hazel Mill Road route for over a decade. "I remember the Hartley house," Dorothy said. She'd made coffee without asking, set 2 mugs on the table, and sat down across from him with the unhurried manner of a woman who understood why he was there and wasn't going to make him drag it out of her. "Helen Hartley was on my route from 04 to 016, signed for a lot of packages over those years." "Do you remember certified mail from around April or May about 10 years ago?" Calvin asked. "Letters addressed to me at that address." Dorothy got up and went to a filing cabinet in the hallway, the kind of person who keeps records, because records have always mattered to her work, and came back with a worn binder. She flipped to a tabbed section near the middle. "I kept delivery logs from my last 15 years on the route," she said. "Personal habit. The service keeps their own, but I liked having my own record." She turned the binder so Calvin could read it. "April 22nd and May 8th, 2 certified items addressed to Calvin Hartley, care of the Hazel Mill Road address, both signed for by the resident." Calvin looked at the signatures. Both receipts bore his mother's signature. "Neither of these is my signature," he said. "No." Dorothy agreed. "Helen signed for both. That's legal if she's a resident of the same address, and the addressee has authorized it, but that authorization has to come from the addressee." She looked at him over her reading glasses. "I also have a note here from the second delivery. May 8th, the woman who answered the door, and I remember this because it struck me at the time as an unusual thing to say, told me to note in my log that, quote, the intended recipient has indicated he does not wish to receive further correspondence from the sender." Dorothy pointed to a line in the log. The note was there in her careful handwriting exactly as she'd said it. Calvin looked at it for a long time. "She told you to write that?" "She did. I wrote it because she asked me to, but I remember thinking it was strange that a mother would be the one to say that about her own son's mail." Dorothy closed the binder. "I'm sorry this is what you found. Can I get a copy of these pages? Graham mentioned you'd likely need them, so I made copies this morning before you arrived," she said, and slid a folder across the table. "They're all there." Sadie Donovan turned 9 years old on a Saturday in November. Claire had rented the back room of a pizza place on Lexington Avenue and filled it with silver balloons and a banner that Sadie had helped design herself, block letters spelling out 9 in 4 different colors, each one a different decision Sadie had apparently debated at length. Calvin brought Miles. He also brought a wrapped gift card and a blue file box that he left in the trunk of his car. The party was loud and crowded with Sadie's classmates, and Miles stationed himself near the air hockey table with the focused energy of a boy who had decided he was going to be good at something and had chosen this. Sadie wore a paper crown that Claire had made the night before, and she moved through the room with the confidence of someone who had been told this day was hers and believed it completely. Calvin watched from near the wall. He was aware of his mother's presence the moment Helen Hartley walked into the room she had been invited by Claire, a decision that Calvin understood, even if it sat uneasily. Helen moved through the party the way she always moved through rooms, with the gentle authority of a woman who believed that her presence was an act of generosity. She found Claire near the cake table and said something that Calvin couldn't hear from across the room. But he could see Claire's expression, the careful blankness of a woman absorbing a remark she's decided not to react to in public. Helen smiled pleasantly and moved on. Calvin crossed the room. "What did she say?" he asked Claire quietly. "It doesn't matter." "Claire," she kept her eyes on the cake. "She said she hoped Sadie had been raised with good values given the circumstances of her birth." The room was full of children and noise and silver balloons, and Sadie was standing at the head of the table in her paper crown, and Calvin looked at his mother across the room, Helen, who was now crouching down to speak to one of Sadie's classmates, with a warm smile, and something that had been holding for weeks let go. He went to the car. He came back with the blue file box. He set it on the table in front of his mother. Helen looked at it, then looked at him. The children were still loud around them, still moving, still entirely unaware. "I need you to look at what's in this box," Calvin said. His voice was low and level. "And then I need you to tell me in front of me what you did. Calvin, this is not the time or place. Grandma Helen." Sadie's voice came from behind him. He turned. She was standing a few feet away, her paper crown slightly crooked, holding a piece of cake on a paper plate that she'd apparently been bringing to someone. She was looking at Helen with the same direct, uncomplicated attention she'd turned on Calvin in the parking lot 3 weeks ago. "Did you know I existed?" Helen Hartley looked at her granddaughter. The pleasant expression on her face didn't exactly fall, it just stopped working. "Of course because Dad didn't know about me," Sadie said. Her tone was not accusatory. It was simply factual, the way 9-year-olds state facts without the instinct to soften them for the comfort of adults. "He didn't know I was born, so I was wondering if you knew." Helen had no answer. The room moved around them. A balloon drifted loose. Miles scored a point at air hockey. Someone's mother laughed at something near the door, and Helen stood in the middle of it all, without a single word available to her. Calvin looked at his mother's face and saw the answer to every question he'd been carrying for 3 weeks. It was right there in the space where a denial should have been and wasn't. "I'm going to take the kids outside for a few minutes," Claire said quietly from beside him. He hadn't heard her approach, but she was there, and her hand rested briefly on Sadie's shoulder, steering her gently toward the door without making it feel like a retreat. Miles appeared from the direction of the air hockey table, reading the room, with the instinct of a child who had learned that when adults go quiet in a particular way, it means something real is happening. Calvin waited until the door closed behind them. Then he turned back to his mother, and the file box sat on the table between them, and there was nothing left to pretend about. The back room of the pizza place had emptied out by the time Calvin and his mother were done. The silver balloons still drifted against the ceiling. The paper crown Sadie had been wearing sat on the table next to the file box, its edges slightly bent from an evening of active wear. Helen sat across from her son with her hands folded in her lap, and Calvin stood because he hadn't been able to make himself sit down once Claire had taken the children outside. "Tell me what you did," he said. "All of it." Out loud, Helen looked at the file box. Then she looked at her son. The pleasant expression she wore in public, the one that had stopped working when Sadie asked her question, had not come back. What was underneath it was something older and more complicated, not cruelty, but a certainty so deep it had never once questioned itself. "I opened the letters," she said. "Both of them." Calvin said nothing. The first one I read and set aside. I thought it might be a misunderstanding, but the second one had the photograph in it, the ultrasound, and I knew then that it was real. Helen's voice was even, which was almost worse than if it had shaken. "You were 26. You had just gotten your contractor's license. You had a plan, Calvin. You had a real plan for the first time in your life. And this girl, you'd known her for 6 months. She had no savings, no career. She was selling pottery at weekend markets. I wasn't going to let that derail everything you'd worked for. So you called her," Calvin said. "I called her, and I told her you'd seen the letters and didn't want contact. And then I called her again a week later, and I may have implied there were legal considerations if she pursued it further. You threatened her. I protected you. She was 26 years old and pregnant and alone," Calvin said, "and you told her the father of her child wanted nothing to do with her, and then you threatened her with a lawyer. That's what you did." Helen's jaw tightened. "I did what I thought was necessary." "And the email rule." Calvin kept his voice level with the same effort it took to hold a frame square, while the concrete sat steady, deliberate, not because it was easy, but because losing control of it would make everything worse. "You set up the forwarding rule yourself, on my account. You'd given me your password the year before when you went to that job site in Murphy and needed me to print something for you. I still had it written down. So you logged into my account and created a rule that forwarded anything from Claire directly to you and then deleted it from my inbox. I knew she'd try email eventually. The room held the particular quiet of a space where children had been and were no longer." Calvin looked at his mother, really looked at her, and understood something that he hadn't quite assembled before this moment. This was not a decision she had made in a panic and regretted. This was a decision she had made, deliberately maintained for years, and had apparently never once revisited with any genuine doubt. "I have a daughter," Calvin said. "She's 9 years old. She spent 9 years without a father, because you decided you knew better than everyone else in this situation what was right. Claire spent 9 years raising a child alone, because you told her the man she contacted wanted nothing to do with her. And I spent 10 years thinking the woman I loved had walked away from me without a word." He set both hands flat on the table, not in anger, but to make the statement concrete and specific. "You took that from all 3 of us?" Helen looked away. For the first time in the conversation, something in her face shifted, not into guilt exactly, but into the beginning of understanding that the certainty she'd carried for 10 years was not the same thing as being right. "I was trying to protect your future," she said. Her voice was quieter now. "That was never yours to decide." Calvin straightened. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to file the legal paperwork to establish paternity and parental rights. Sadie and Miles are both going to see a counselor separately at first, together, when the counselor thinks they're ready. And you are not going to have access to either of my children until you have acknowledged what you did not to me, but to Claire, and to Sadie when she's old enough to hear it, and until you've agreed to speak to a family therapist. Not a pastor, not a friend. A licensed therapist." Helen looked at him. "Those are the terms," Calvin said. "They're not negotiable, and they're not temporary. If those conditions are met, we find a way forward. If they're not, then you don't see Miles or Sadie. Not for birthdays, not for holidays, not at all." "Calvin, I'm not angry, Mom." And the strange thing was that it was true, or at least it was becoming true in real time, the anger burning down into something harder and more structural. "I'm clear. There's a difference." He picked up the file box from the table. He picked up Sadie's paper crown. He carried both of them to the door, and he left his mother sitting in the back room of the pizza place with the silver balloons drifting overhead, and he went to find his children. Claire's car was in the parking lot. She was sitting on the hood with Miles beside her, both of them looking at something on his phone, a video of some kind, based on the small sounds coming from the speaker. Sadie was crouched near the curb examining something on the ground, with the focused attention she gave to most things she found interesting. Calvin set the file box in the trunk of his car. He held on to the paper crown. Sadie looked up when she heard his footsteps. He walked over and crouched down to her level, and he held out the crown. "Belongs to the birthday girl," he said. Sadie took it and put it back on her head, slightly crooked. "Is everything okay?" "It will be," Calvin said. That's the honest answer. She seemed to consider this with the same seriousness she brought to most things. "Okay," she said, and went back to examining whatever was on the ground, a beetle he could see, now making its determined way along the edge of the curb. Calvin stood and walked to where Claire was sitting on the hood of her car. Miles had apparently reached the end of the video and was now trying to explain its contents to Claire, who was listening with the expression of someone doing their genuine best to care about whatever it was. She glanced up when Calvin stopped in front of her. "Miles." Calvin said, "Go keep Sadie company for a minute." Miles looked between his father and Claire with the perception of a 10-year-old who understood more than adults generally credited, and climbed off the hood without argument. He went and crouched beside Sadie, and within 30 seconds, he was apparently as interested in the beetle as she was. Calvin looked at Claire. The parking lot light was overhead, and slightly orange the way those lights always were. "She admitted everything," he said. "The letters, the calls, the email rule. All of it." Claire absorbed this. She'd known it was coming, had known it since the moment Helen couldn't answer Sadie's question inside. But knowing something is coming and receiving it are not the same thing. She looked at the ground for a moment, and then back at him. "Okay," she said. "I've set conditions for her to have any contact with the kids. She needs to acknowledge what she did to you eventually to Sadie, and she needs to see a family therapist. Until both of those things happen, she doesn't have access to Miles or Sadie." Claire was quiet for a moment. That couldn't have been easy to say to her. It was necessary. He wasn't looking for credit, and his tone made that clear. "I also want to talk to you about the legal side of things. I'm going to file for formal recognition of paternity. That gives Sadie legal protections, inheritance, medical decisions, all of it. Graham can draw up a co-parenting agreement that works around your schedule and mine. I don't want to make any of this harder for you than it's already been." Claire looked at him. The careful distance she'd maintained over the past 3 weeks, not cold, but measured the reasonable caution of a woman who had been badly hurt by trusting this particular family, was still there. But it was different now than it had been the night at Blue Ridge Coffee. Something in it had shifted the way ice shifts when the temperature change is not breaking, just beginning to change its state. "I have a session already set up for Sadie with someone good," Claire said. "Dr. Patricia Waverly. She specializes in family transitions. If you want to have Miles see someone too, I can ask for a recommendation." "I'd appreciate that," she nodded. "I'll text you her number tonight." He was about to step back, about to go collect Miles and let this evening finish, when Claire spoke again. "I don't forgive everything yet," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Not because I want to hold it over anyone, just because it's true, and I think you'd rather I be honest." "I would," Calvin said. "And I'm not asking you to." She looked at him for a moment longer than the conversation strictly required. "Sadie has a school thing next Friday, a science presentation she's been working on. She wants you there." "I'll be there. It starts at 9. The measured quality in her voice was still present, but there was something alongside it now, not warmth exactly. Not yet, but the beginning of its possibility. "I'll save you a seat." In the weeks that followed, Calvin built new routines, the same way he built everything with attention to the load-bearing parts first. He picked Sadie up on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and dropped her at school on his way to his first job site. He kept his Friday evenings clear for Miles. He and Claire exchanged texts about schedules and logistics with the careful courtesy of two people who were learning to trust a new structure before they trusted each other. Miles went to see a counselor named Dr. Aaron Briggs on Wednesday afternoons. He came home from the first session quieter than usual, and from the second session wanting to talk about it over dinner, which Calvin took as a good sign. Sadie's sessions with Dr. Waverly were on Mondays, and Claire reported with something approaching relief in her texts that Sadie had taken to them with characteristic directness. Helen Hartley called on the second Sunday after the party. Calvin answered. She said she understood the conditions he'd laid out, and that she had made an appointment with a therapist for the following Tuesday. She said it in the tone of someone reading from a prepared statement, but she said it. Calvin told her he was glad, and that when she was ready to speak to Claire, he would help arrange it. Then he said goodbye and hung up, and he did not feel victorious, which was how he knew he'd handled it correctly. One Saturday afternoon in late November, Calvin was replacing a rotted board on the back porch of the Sycamore Street house, a project he'd been deferring for 2 months when he heard the back gate open. Miles came through first, then Sadie, who had been dropped off an hour earlier for what was being termed by all parties a sibling afternoon, a phrase Miles had resisted until Sadie pointed out that it was just hanging out with a different word for it, and Miles had agreed that framing was acceptable. Calvin kept working. He could hear them behind him, some negotiation happening about something, the specific rhythmic back and forth of two kids working out the terms of a shared activity. He finished securing the board, set down the hammer, and turned around. Miles and Sadie were sitting together on the wooden swing at the far end of the porch. The swing had been there when Calvin bought the house. Old, slightly weathered, repainted once. He'd fixed the chain last spring, tightened the hardware, checked the weight rating. It was solid now. Sadie had a marker in her hand. She was writing something on the wooden seat with careful, deliberate letters. Miles was watching and offering what appeared to be unsolicited opinions about the letter, spacing based on the expression on Sadie's face. Calvin walked to the edge of the porch and looked. She'd written both their names on the seat. Miles on the left, Sadie on the right in her best handwriting, which was objectively better than Miles's. "You're going to get marker on your jeans," Calvin said. "Already happened," Sadie said serenely without looking up. Miles looked at Calvin with an expression that clearly communicated "I told her." Calvin looked at the swing at the two names side by side, slightly uneven in size, permanent in the way. Marker on wood is permanent. And then he looked at his two kids sitting in it together, and he didn't say anything else about the jeans. He was still on the porch when Claire arrived to pick up Sadie. He heard her car in the driveway and came around the side of the house to meet her. She was in a jacket he hadn't seen before, her hair back, car keys in her hand. "How'd it go?" she asked. "She wrote on the swing," he said. Claire's expression went through something brief and complicated. "It's good," he said. "It's fine, it's good." She looked at him for a moment, the car keys turning once in her hand. Behind them, through the back gate, they could hear Miles explaining something to Sadie in his particular lecturing tone, and Sadie making sounds that indicated she was listening or performing. Listening at a level that satisfied Miles, which was close enough. "Dinner Friday," Claire said. The question was quiet, almost offhand, the way people say things they mean but want to leave room around. "Just the two of us. The kids can be with my sister." Calvin looked at her. He thought about a parking lot and a coffee shop and a lab on Merriman Avenue and a back room full of silver balloons, and how much had been dismantled and what was being built in its place, and how long that kind of building actually takes. "Yes," he said. Claire nodded once, the way people nod when a thing is settled. She put the car keys in her pocket. "I'll make the reservation," she said, and went through the back gate to collect her daughter. Calvin stood in the side yard of his house on Sycamore Street and listened to Sadie protesting the end of the afternoon, and Miles immediately negotiating a specific future date for the next one, and Claire's voice threading through both of them with the patience of a woman who had been doing this alone for 9 years and was only now cautiously beginning to do it differently. He stayed there until the gate clicked shut. Then he went back to the porch, picked up his hammer, and finished the work.